Cassie L. Chadwick was born on the 10th of October 1857 in Eastwood, Ontario. Her birth name was Elizabeth Bigley. Her childhood was fairly comfortable as her family owned a small farm in Eastwood and she got on well with her three sisters and brother. As well as owning land, her father had a decent job, being employed by the Grand Trunk Railway as a section boss. Her family called her Betsy as a term of endearment, yet as a child she caused problems as she was known to tell fibs and dreamed of a more lavish life. At the age of 14, Cassie moved to Woodstock in Ontario. Once there, her first fraudulent act began. She opened up a bank account in Woodstock with only the little cash that she had, and by showing a letter of inheritance which claimed that an English uncle had left her a small sum of money. This forged inheritance looked authentic enough to fool a local bank, which then proceeded to issuing her checks, allowing her to spend the money in advance. Within weeks, she was caught and arrested. Because of her young age, as well as a claim that she was insane, no trial took place, and Cassie was released. Although sources vary about what went on during her early life, most likely after spending various years living in Woodstock, she finally returned home in 1875. Once there, she discovered that one of her sisters, called Alice, had got married and was moving to Ohio in the States. Hoping that there she may be able to have a better life, she moved to Ohio with her sister. Upon arrival, she briefly stayed with her sister and brother-in-law while she got settled in. Cassie rented a lower floor of a house in Cleveland from a Mrs. Brown. She decided to hide her identity using the alias Madame Lydia Devere. She claimed to be widowed and used her unknown identity as well as a bank loan which she had taken out using her sister's furniture as the collateral to set up a business as a clairvoyant. In 1879, when she was just 22, she set up another successful scam. Cassie managed to replicate a calling card that were used by the upper classes. Hers read, Miss Bigley, Heiress to $15,000. Due to the bad practices in shops at that time, all she did was enter a shop, choose an expensive item, and then write a check for a sum that exceeded the price. Merchants were willing to give her the difference in cash between the value of the check and the goods bought. And if anyone questioned her, all she did was show her card, and it worked every time. On the 21st of November 1882, Cassie, or as she was now known, Lydia Devere, got married to Dr. Wallace S. Springsteen in Cleveland. She became Mrs. Lydia Springsteen and moved in with her husband. Problems started for Cassie when a photograph of the wedding was published in a local newspaper called the Plain Dealer. Cassie had defrauded many of Cleveland's locals, and after having seen the photograph and the article, they started showing up at Springsteen's door. Among those that arrived to Springsteen's house was Cassie's sister, Alice, as well as many merchants that Cassie had defrauded. After learning of Cassie's past and hearing stories from those that she had scammed, Springsteen decided to throw her out of her house after just 2 weeks and filed for a divorce. By early 1883, only a few months after the marriage, Springsteen was successful in getting a divorce, but he was forced to pay off Cassie's debts. With the end of her first marriage, Cassie was left without financial support and again set up her business as a clairvoyant. This time, she called herself Madame Marie Larose in order to stay away from the bad reputation that she had gained when she was Lydia Devere. While as Madame Marie Larose, she met and married a farmer from Trumbull County called John R. Scott. Before their marriage, Cassie convinced Scott to sign a prenuptial agreement. She did this to benefit herself, as it allowed her to establish which assets would be hers in the case of a divorce. After 4 years of being married and living on a farm, She grew tired of her life with Scott and wanted out. Cassie went with a lawyer in Youngstown, stating that Scott had been unfaithful, and asked her lawyer to file for a divorce on the grounds of adultery. Whether or not the divorce was granted is unknown, but it was presumably granted, and she left Scott's home after filing for the divorce. The next record of Cassie is in 1889, when she was tried for forgery. The verdict was guilty. She was sentenced to 9.5 years in a penitentiary. Fortunately, after just 4 years she was released on parole for good behaviour, and in 1893 she returned to Cleveland. Once in Cleveland, she again changed her name, and this time called herself Mrs. Cassie Hoover. With her savings, she opened up a brothel on the city's west side, hoping to make a nice profit. It was at her establishment that she met her third husband, Leroy Chadwick. He was a wealthy doctor whose wife had passed away a few years prior. Cassie knew of his situation and used it to her advantage. Cassie also introduced herself as a widow and acted like a kind, polite lady who ran a respectable boarding house for women. However, Leroy Chadwick responded to her remarks at it being a boarding house, saying that it was a well-known brothel. Knowing that claiming any involvement in the illicit business would do her no favours, she fainted upon hearing Chadwick's words. Once she was back on her feet, she told Chadwick she would never run such an establishment. As well as straight out lying, she begged the doctor if she could leave the establishment with him before anyone suspected her of being part of the illegal operations there, as her job was just to teach the girls etiquette. In 1897, Cassie and Leroy got married. It's unclear if her husband knew of her child Emil, who had been born around the mid-1880s, and according to some sources, was left by Cassie to be raised by the woman at the brothel. Thanks to her husband, Cassie was finally living the lavish lifestyle that she had always dreamed of. She lived on Cleveland's Euclid Avenue, then known as Millionaire's Row, yet she wasn't accepted by her wealthy neighbours, and she didn't fit in very well at social events. Dreaming of more wealth, believing that way her neighbours would look up to her, she planned one of America's greatest ever scams. During a visit to New York City, she asked one of her husband's acquaintances, a lawyer named Dylan, to take her to Andrew Carnegie's home. She went into the house and pretended that she was speaking to Carnegie himself. However, in reality she had only been talking to the housekeeper. Upon her return, she dropped a forged promissory note worth $2 million with Carnegie's signature. She told Dillon that she was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, and due to her father's guilt, he showered her with money. She then went on to claim that in her Cleveland home, she had more promissory notes worth around $7 million, and that upon her supposed father's death, she would inherit $400 million. Despite telling this information to Dillon in secrecy, this information was leaked to various American financial markets, and then banks began to offer their services to Cassie. For over 8 years, she used her fake background to obtain loans that totaled between $10 and $20 million. Bankers charged Cassie extremely high interest rates, but they worked on the assumption that Carnegie would repay any debts, and in any case, upon his death, the inheritance would have to repay all debts in full. She believed her con was perfect, as no one would dare to ask if Cassie was really his daughter, out of fear of embarrassing one of America's richest men. With all this money, Cassie lived like a queen. She bought a golden organ, many diamond necklaces, and enough clothes to fill hundreds of closets. It was a better life than she could have ever imagined, but soon it would all come crashing down on her. In November 1904, Herbert B. Newton, a banker from Massachusetts, gave Cassie an $190,000 loan. However, after learning that none of Cassie's loans had been paid off, he called his loan in because he knew she wouldn't pay, and when she didn't, he sued her. Eventually, Carnegie was asked about Cassie as well as the promissory notes. He stated that he had no idea who she was and that he hadn't signed a promissory note in more than 30 years. In a flee attempt, Cassie went to her apartment at the Hotel Breslin in New York, but within weeks she was arrested and taken back to Cleveland to stand trial. Just as the scandal broke out, her husband, Leroy Chadwick, filed for a divorce, and then he left on a trip to Europe with his daughter to avoid any problems. The news had huge repercussions on Cleveland's banking community. Some banks, such as the Citizens National Bank, were forced to shut down due to bankruptcy, and many more lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. At her trial, many of her neighbors from the Millionaires' Row came to watch. Furthermore, even Andrew Carnegie was in attendance, as he was curious to see the woman that had successfully conned the nation's bankers into believing that she was his heir. On the 10th of March 1905, she was sentenced to 14 years in prison, as well as a fine of $70,000 for conspiracy to bankrupt the Citizens National Bank, as well as conspiracy against the government. On the 1st of January 1906, Cassie was transported to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. With her, she brought many goods, such as nice clothing, photographs, and furniture, in order to make her stay a tiny bit more bearable. This was something very unusual and shouldn't have been permitted, but the prison warden made an exception due to her celebrity status. After just a year and a half in prison, her health started to go downhill. Cassie began to write down funeral arrangements and instructed her son to purchase a tombstone for the family plot. On the 17th of September 1907, she collapsed, possibly due to a heart attack, and was left blind. A month later, she began suffering from stomach and heart problems, and on the 10th of October 1907, at the age of 50, she passed away. Cassie was buried in the Episcopal Cemetery in Canada, what today is known as Woodstock Anglican Cemetery. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Cassie Chadwick. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and a comment down below. That will be all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.